The Channel Islands off the California coast are a largely barren, windswept archipelago. One island in particular, named San Nicolas, was considered one of the 8 sites worth testing a nuclear bomb on in World War II. But instead of bombing the island, the United States Navy has used it as a weapons testing and training facility. It's located 61 miles from the nearest point on the mainland coast of California, and it's approximately 22 square miles. The island is occupied by approximately 200 military and civilian personnel. There are radar stations and telemetry equipment spread throughout the island. It's just over 9 miles long and 3 miles wide. Some of the civilian personnel have worked on that island for decades, and through the years they've heard some interesting stories from the various military personnel that have been stationed there. There's a couple in particular that stand out, and once I read these accounts, I started to look into the island's history. Little did I know I would stumble across a horrifically tragic and haunting past. I spent 2 years on San Nicolas as an electronics technician after I got out of A school. Most of the time you were keeping up with maintenance and getting prepared for the next test they were going to do. Unless there was something big going off at Vandenberg, it was a pretty quiet post. All the base facilities and housing were focused in an area called Nicktown. They had a bowling alley, a small shop. There wasn't a whole lot to do. The island itself is pretty desolate. The only thing I was told is if it's foggy and it's nighttime, you don't want to venture too far from any place that's well lit. The entire island's, for the most part, surrounded by cliffs. I spent the first few months getting to know everybody, learning how to do my job, and getting a general feel for the layout of the island and the base itself. I was working primarily with a petty officer by the last name of Reynolds. We spent a lot of our time traveling around the island as needed, but when there wasn't a real need to go around the island, we pretty much stayed in Nicktown. Reynolds had been on the island for 6 months, and he knew the person I replaced. He said he was a good guy, but towards the end he was a little bit spooked by something. To help keep his identity private, we'll just call him Piper. Apparently Piper was sent out in the fog to take care of some issues that happened at one of the telemetry stations. It was approximately 3.5 miles away from Nicktown. Reynolds said that he was threatened with an Article 15 for failure to fulfill his duties. He had gone to the radar site, failed to make the repairs that were required, and had left the site unsecured. When he returned back to the post, he seemed shaken. When he went back to Nicktown, Reynolds said he was never the same. There was something off about him. Something out there had scared him. I never repeated what Reynolds told me, and Reynolds had never told anyone else but me this story. The base kind of swept it under the rug. We didn't talk much more about it for quite some time, but we did give that radar post a nickname, Station Piper. About a month later, when Vandenberg was testing another missile and we had some issues with the telemetry station, this time it was my turn to check out Station Piper. But I would be lucky. I would be able to take Reynolds with me. They didn't want anyone to come back this time scared or failing to do their job. Besides, it's easier to have a buddy holding the flashlight than have to hold it all by yourself. We packed up the service truck and started headed down the road. It took us a little bit longer than normal because the fog was so thick you could barely see past the headlights. We pulled up to Station Piper and left the truck running. The headlights were pointed at the door into the building. These buildings are watertight. They don't want the humidity and the salt air in there ruining the electronics. Reynolds was testing the equipment while I was running down a checklist. We'd only been there about 10 minutes when the radio started acting up. It was making a strange buzzing noise and it wouldn't stop, so we just turned it off. We could hear the one in the truck going off too, but we didn't pay no attention to it. Reynolds laughed and joked about the fact that Piper used to turn his radio off when he came to this station. I was reminded that I had the radio off, so I turned the radio back on, and you could hear this faint whispering. At first you couldn't make out what was being said. I decided I'd get a radio check. We got a check back. The radio was working fine. But instead of dead air and silence, when you weren't pushing the button down, you got whispering, and it got louder. Reynolds noticed it and looked at me. I looked at him and I shook my head and said, I don't know what's going on. The whispering got louder, and at this point, you could hear a number of voices speaking over each other. I told Reynolds, I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not superstitious, but I do know when something's not right. I turned off the radio, and we redoubled our efforts to get out of there. No sooner had we decided that something wasn't right when things got real wrong. We didn't waste any time. Reynolds gathered up his tools, I gathered up the paperwork, we secured the building and started making our way to the truck. As we approached the truck, it shut off. It wouldn't turn. It was completely dead. We didn't have headlights, we didn't have running lights. We both looked at each other and couldn't believe what was going on. I wouldn't say at this point we were in a full state of panic, but as we were looking at each other with apprehension, I know we were both thinking the same thing. This is how it must have started for Piper. I popped the hood of that truck and Reynolds and I went out there determined to figure out what in the hell was going on. We spent a few minutes cleaning up the battery cables and I got inside that cab and started that truck right up. Reynolds put the hood down and that's when I saw what Piper must have seen. Just out of the range of the headlights, about 6 or 7 feet in the air, was a pair of glowing red eyes. I'd never seen anything like it, and there's nothing on that island that stands that tall. I must have had some sort of strange look on my face of shock or concern, because when Reynolds got into the cab of the truck, he said, "What the hell's wrong with you? Let's get out of here." And that's when I pointed down the road and I said, "Do you see that?" We both sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. And that's when we both realized that it was closing the distance. It was approaching the truck. I said to hell with this. I turned the truck around and started heading back to base faster than what's safe. But as fast as we were going, the fog slowed us down. You couldn't see much further than the front of the truck. That's when Reynolds said, "It's still there, man. You've got to go." He was right. I looked in the rearview mirror and they were there. I couldn't believe it. That was when I truly panicked. I felt like something unnatural was chasing us down that road. And if it hadn't have been for the fog, I would have pushed that truck as fast as it would go. As we were driving down the road, the fog began to lift and the eyes disappeared. We made the left-hand turn to head back towards Nicktown. We could see the base lights glowing through the fog. And as we started around the final corner, both of us noticed that there were these shadows running alongside the truck. Reynolds and I got back to base, and we never spoke about it again. I never mentioned this to anybody, and I'm sure he never mentioned it to anyone he knows either. We didn't know what happened, but we knew one thing for sure. We understand what Piper experienced at this point. And whatever it was, he was alone when he experienced it. Before reading this alleged paranormal encounter on San Nicolas Island, I knew next to nothing about the island itself. I had no idea it was considered to be one of the places they would test the atomic bombs before they dropped them on Japan. And it seems kind of shocking that you would do that just 60 miles off the coast of California. But what was also shocking and really sombering was the history of the island itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that San Nicolas Island, like the other Channel Islands, has been populated for at least 10,000 years, though perhaps not continuously. In the 1500s, when Spanish expeditions sailed past the island, they failed to mention any of the Native American inhabitants. They merely marked the islands on their chart and continued exploring the California coast. At that time, the island was inhabited by a Native American people named the Nicoleño. They were closely related to the peoples of the Santa Catalina Islands and the San Clemente Islands. Some have speculated that at this time the Nicoleño population was at its peak and could have reached as many as 1,000 individuals. After 1770, it's thought that the Spanish missions began transferring the Native Americans from the islands into their mission system, and many of them were coerced into forced labor or imprisoned within the walls of the missions themselves. As far as can be told, the Nicoleño people were very peaceful and accepting of strangers. They were trusting. They lived off the land. They built their homes out of whale bones that washed up along the shore. In 1814, a party of Native Alaskan otter hunters working with the Russian-American Company massacred most of the islanders after accusing them of killing a Native Alaskan hunter. The Russians left the Native Alaskan hunters behind. The Russians believed that by leaving supplies with native Alaskan hunters, they could conduct trade with the Nicoleño for otter skins. It's unclear exactly what events transpired, but the archaeological evidence would suggest that the male Nicoleño people were bound and then bludgeoned to the side of the temple, possibly with a seal clubbing device of some sort. It's also believed that the native Alaskan hunters held the women hostage in order to keep the men subdued and allow this to happen. When it was all said and done, there was fewer than 30 Nicoleño people left, and the majority of the women had been raped and devastated. Hearing of this massacre, the Santa Barbara Mission on the mainland sponsored a rescue mission, and in late 1835, most of the tribe was rounded up, put on ships, and sent back to the mission to live within the walls. Unfortunately, the majority of them would succumb to disease. One woman was left behind, Juana Maria. She was actually stranded on the island for over a decade. She lived all by herself amongst the remains of her people. It would be 18 years before fur trapper George Nidever would find her and bring her back to the Santa Barbara Mission. By all accounts, she was excited to come back. Unfortunately, no one could speak her language. Despite this, Juana Maria would spend her days singing and smiling. It is said that she was very happy. Sadly, 7 weeks after her arrival at the mission, she would die of dysentery, the last of her people. Juana Maria's belongings were stored in a museum in San Francisco, and unfortunately were destroyed in the Great Fire. A song that she used to like to sing, called the Toki Toki Song, was actually recorded on a wax cylinder. The book by Scott Odell, The Island of the Blue Dolphins, is based on her story. Years later, they would discover the site of the massacre. Nearly 300 skeletal remains of men, women, and children. With so much suffering and bloodshed, and the loss of such a peaceful people, it wouldn't surprise me if there was something strange going on that island. Take a moment to check out the history of the island itself and the Nicoleño people. And keep in mind that for 18 years, Juana Maria lived alone amongst the empty homes of her friends and family, and among the ghosts of her massacred people.